Thank you very much, Michael. I was worried that you were going to start using my lip gloss in case you got dehydrated since it was here, but I'm glad you stayed over there.
Only a weekend.
So it's a huge honor for me to be giving this talk because, as Michael said, it's sort of to celebrate the fact that I'm not only at Sussex, but for me that I'm at SPRU. And I really chose SPRU as a place to be because it has been, since it was founded, a real hotbed of thinking and of debate around not just innovation, but also growth, also employment issues. I stand in the footsteps of the giants who had my chair before myself, Chris Freeman especially, Keith Pavitt, Nick von Tunselman, and I think what they all shared was a real desire not to make the whole innovation discourse a bit too comfy. Chris Freeman and Carlotta, where are you, Carlotta? There you are. Carlotta, who, by the way, I'm so happy she's going to be giving the vote of thanks. She and Chris worked many years together, and I think both of them, one of the things that just make them exceptional is precisely that. I mean, Chris, really wasn't satisfied with just talking about innovation. He immediately asked things like, well, what will its effect be on things like the profit-wage relationship, which was, of course, something that was really also important to the classical economists before the neoclassical revolution, which I might have some time to touch on. And so what I want to do is exactly that, to really, not get too comfortable around innovation. Because I must say, I talk to policymakers and business leaders all the time, and it's very hard to argue with them when you're just talking about things like, the knowledge economy, big data, entrepreneurship, intangible capital. It only becomes difficult to talk to people when you start making relationships with those variables, with some more uncomfortable areas like inequality. And the reason I've put these big challenges up here is because I really think that one of the big challenges for SPRU today and for all people who are talking about innovation today is really to argue that what we're looking for is not just what people call smart growth, which is innovation-led growth, but really to try to make sure that we achieve growth that is smart, inclusive, and sustainable. Because if you think about the 1990s, there was plenty of growth, which we're starving for today. Many countries are thinking how to get a post-crisis recovery going. There was plenty of innovation, but it was actually a decade in which inequality rose very rapidly. And what I'm going to try to do is both make some recommendations, if you want, to how to think about post-crisis recovery in terms of achieving these big challenges, but also provide a different interpretation of why we sometimes get all sorts of negative things also happening when we have innovation. So why did innovation and inequality in the 1990s actually co-evolve? And of course, the other big challenge, especially in places like the UK and the US, is not just smart, inclusive, sustainable growth, but really how to rebalance the economy away from finance towards real production, productive capital. Minsky is someone who actually talked a lot about this in his days. And I'm going to try to touch on in a semi-superficial way, but I want to do it in a way that really challenges some core assumptions that also my own community often holds, but for sure within the economics community we hold. And so the reason I put these two quotes here by Keynes is that to actually think about those big challenges all together, what we really need is a very active public policy, an active government. And unfortunately, I think that one of the biggest barriers we have today is that how we think about government in the economy, and this is the other second wonderful quote where Keynes says that the economists, unfortunately, are very much ruling the way that policymakers think. How we think about government today within economic theory is extremely narrow. So if we do want to be thinking about big challenges around, long-run growth, which is smart, inclusive, and sustainable, we really have to be thinking more a la Karl Polanyi, who talked about the role of public policy very much in terms of creating and shaping markets, not just fixing them. Okay, so I'm going to keep sort of coming back to this issue about how could we talk about policymaking beyond just fixing market failures. But I really want to sort of say it now because, in fact, this is probably the biggest point. But then, the question is, what comes next? What exactly are we talking about if it's not just fixing different patches here and there? And how I want to do this, just to bring a bit of structure to this talk, is to rethink some what I'm calling kind of basic pillars And the first one is, what do we actually even know about private investment? Because as someone who, again, often talks to policymakers, I feel like I often have to justify why we need a policy here and there. But in some ways, we should also just begin by thinking, what justifications do we have, what knowledge do we have of what actually drives private business investment before we even talk about the public part. And I want to challenge some thinking there. When I talk about the public part, as I already said, I want to provide an alternative view to the market failure perspective of what's guiding government policy. I want to challenge the usual interpretation of the current problem as simply big bad finance versus the real economy, by really talking about just how financialized the real economy is, and how the real problem today is not a lack of finance, but a lack of a particular type of finance. Okay, so not quantity but quality. And I want to sort of as I'm doing this, build towards one of the key points, which is that when we actually have a different framework for what it is that the public sector is doing in an economy that is achieving that kind of long-run innovation-led growth, we really have to admit that, in fact, the state is one of the lead risk takers, which means all sorts of potential failures. And so unless we also think about the risk-reward relationship in a different way, beyond the usual way where we think it's just going to be through tax that the reward comes back, then this has been, in fact, one of the lead causes of inequality, I'm going to be arguing. Basically telling you the whole punchline now, you can all leave in 2 minutes. And lastly, but it's important because we might get lost along the way, so at least you've heard it in the beginning. Lastly, I really want to argue that when we do have the public sector, but even the third sector, when we have Wellcome Trusts and the CRIC centers entering the life sciences landscape, we should really be demanding great transformative power rather than working within existing biases. And in order to do that, you have to have all sorts of expertise also within government. You have to be investing within your own structures and not outsourcing all the intelligence of government agencies. Okay, so start on the first pillar, which will be very quick. One of the points of Keynes, which I think is sometimes lost, John Maynard Keynes, is that the reason that you need government spending at all is really that the I part of GDP, right? This is just a very basic equation for those that aren't economists. GDP is consumption expenditures, private business investment, government spending, and net exports. And the I part is pretty remarkable because it is not only pro-cyclical, private business investment, in other words, too much during the boom, too little during the bust, but also extremely volatile, always in the boom and the bust. This isn't true of a lot of the other elements. For example, consumption is quite stable. It's basically a function of disposable income. If you just plot the I using an Excel sheet and the publicly available data, you'll see it is extremely volatile. And what he basically said is that, this is because it's driven by animal spirits. And that word has come back into fashion now with the financial crisis. So all sorts of books talking about irrational exuberance and, Robert Shiller's work, he just won the Nobel Prize. But I think, it's not just about behavioral finance. It's not just about this issue about bandwagon effects and herd effects. It actually is a key point, which is that what drives business investment are not little tweaks and, say, taxes, but actually the gut instincts about where the future technological and market opportunities are. And it's very hard to actually get a formula for what is actually driving those gut instincts. And this is why, in fact, it's very volatile. You might think that there's a great opportunity out there. Someone else might not. You might change your mind tomorrow. This leads to all sorts of volatility, as well as things like the herd effects and the bandwagon effects. And within SPRU and within the innovation studies community, at the sectoral level, at the microeconomic level, there's been all sorts of evidence really confirming that, which is, where's my water? Here. Which is, for example, if you plot entry rates in different industries, right, entry and exit in different industries, there's very little correlation between entry and current profit levels. What is driving new firms to enter an industry is really their perception about the future opportunities that are present in that industry. Okay? And Keith Pavitt, who held my chair before me, one of the giants that I mentioned, he and others, in fact, tried to develop proxies for that, for technological opportunities. He wrote a very famous paper, very important paper on sectoral taxonomies of innovation, where that variable was very important in terms of thinking about what is, in fact, changing market structure. But there's a wonderful Warren Buffett quote, which, here it is, where he, as a very important investor, he says this very clearly, that, people invest to make money and potential taxes have never scared them off. In other words, your current costs, even just making it cheaper, whether it's through reduction in capital gains tax, which he's talking about here, but even, and again, just thinking about current research within the innovation community of people like Pierre Monin, there's very little evidence that even things like R&D tax credits actually make innovation happen that would not have happened anyway. What drove Steve Jobs and Bill Gates to do what they did was not because it was cheaper. Okay, it was the real perception about these future opportunities in that area. Now, the problem is that when we talk about this in terms of animal spirits, and this is why I have a lion and a pussycat on the front cover of my latest book, is that you think of tigers and wolves and lions, and there's this wonderful letter that Keynes wrote to Roosevelt where he says something which I don't think has been developed by, if you want, Keynesians after him, which is really rethinking even that term, which he's not talking about that term here, but he says, actually these businesses that we're trying to get to invest, this is, writing at a very difficult time after the Great Depression, are not wolves or tigers, but they're actually domesticated animals, gerbils and pussycats. And if you take that seriously, this is a very different policy world. If you think that you have a lion in a cage, right, business in a cage, which is being impeded, whether it's through tax or regulation, they're dying to invest. What do you do as a policymaker? Well, get rid of all those impediments, get rid of tax, reduce the costs of things like R&D, introduce the patent box, which maybe we'll have time to talk about later. Paul Nightingale talks about it as the stupidest policy ever, and I definitely agree. It will only reduce government budget. It will not incentivize innovation. This is very different than if you sort of, no, this isn't a pussycat. This is a very cute little tiger or lion, where what the problem is there is actually to get the courage up, to actually grow up and actually get the courage to invest. If what's driving private business investment is the perception of future technological and market opportunities, as a policymaker, that's what you should really be thinking about. And in fact, I will be talking about green later, but just quickly, when GE and Vestas 2 years ago decided to halt 2 of their projects in the UK, one of them was for offshore wind, what they said was not that it's too expensive in the UK. They said there's no green vision in the UK. And the real problem in economics, I think, is we don't have a way to talk about that. How do you include the word vision in an econometric model if it's so important? What I've just told you, it is really important. There's all sorts of both macro and micro studies talking about how what's driving business investment is this perception about these future opportunities, the vision for those opportunities. So the second point is there's all sorts of recent thinking, including my work, but also work by people like David Mowry, Dominique Ferré, definitely Dick Nelson, one of the first people who talked about this, that really one of the key aspects that are one of the key factors that drive these technological opportunities are sort of, not just big, but very strategic vision, mission-oriented spending by government in particular areas, okay, before the private sector enters. And the reason I have this quote up here is because this is what we're sort of not saying, right? I mean, what this particular quote is coming from is from an Economist magazine that was thinking about the third industrial revolution, thinking about the whole green economy, nanotechnology. And what they're saying is, in the end, all that government has to do is set the playing field, right? Fund the public goods, fund the basic research, the schools, the infrastructure, but leave the rest to the revolutionaries. When we think about these technological opportunities really being driven by big government spending in particular areas, what we're talking about, in fact, is places like Silicon Valley, which we'll be talking about in a minute, but also all over the world, including China today in the green economy, where, in fact, the revolutionary new technologies very much came from government not just stepping back and creating the conditions for innovation, but taking a very courageous, what I'll call entrepreneurial role in actually making big things happen that really would not have happened, and actually investing directly in them, not just incentivizing the business sector to invest, but actually make things happen before business even knew what it was. The history of nanotechnology is fascinating because the word itself came out of civil sector workers, or civil servants in the National Science Foundation. You didn't have business going to government saying, oh, we have this great idea, it'd be great, but it's just too expensive. It was actually the idea, the vision, the mission actually came out of government itself. And so the reason I call it the entrepreneurial state is precisely because the way I define entrepreneurship, which also others defined, including Schumpeter himself, is not just setting up a company. It's actually the willingness, ability to really take on real risk, right? So, and uncertainty, fundamental uncertainty of the Knightian kind. Both Knight and Keynes distinguish risk from uncertainty. Risk is, you can build a probability distribution around it. Uncertainty is the probability that a country will actually win a war, that your husband or wife might divorce you, that an R&D project will make it or not. Innovation really is an example of uncertainty, but being willing to actually engage in that upper right-hand quadrant there is what I'm talking about in particular sectors. And what's interesting is that it's not just the usual public good argument where, okay, fine, we know the government's very important to fund the basic research, because that would really just be this part here. What we know is that this high risk and uncertainty is in fact throughout the innovation chain. And these orange words here are different types of public sector institutions, including ARPA-E. Today, I just gave a keynote at the ARPA-E Innovation Summit last week, where even all sorts of applied research has had to be done by public sector institutions within different sectors, because not only because uncertainty is high, but because in fact the mission required the entire chain to be coherent and led by a plan, as opposed to just allowing it to come about through market processes. And this is also about early stage funding of the actual companies. Everyone's always worried about picking winners, that the government, again, should just sit in the background creating the conditions. But Apple, Compaq, and Intel actually all got their early stage seed financing from different types of government institutions. In the case of Apple, it was $500K from the SBIC, one of their grant programs. But this is SBIR money, which in the UK we have sort of tried to imitate through a similar program called SBRI. And what's fascinating here, this is actually comparing private venture capital with this public sort of venture capital type money that's often through procurement, is it's actually increased over time. Okay? Now, why is this? Well, venture capital increasingly is demanding their returns in 3, maximum 5 years, more like 3. All the attention is on the exit, mainly through an IPO. Well, that's, that kind of financing, it might be fine for gadgets, but in clean technology and nanotechnology and information technology, where you have 15 to 20-year time lags, what you really need is sort of patient, long-term committed finance. And I'll be arguing also later that this is increasingly coming actually from state investment banks around the world. The US is actually in some ways losing its edge in some new areas. This is recent data, and in the book I talk a lot about the iPhone, which is of course the phenomenal product, one of the phenomenal products that have come out of Silicon Valley. But when you ask yourselves what made the iPhone so smart, of course we need the geniuses like Steve Jobs to put together all these technologies in a very cool way, focusing on design, focusing on the simplicity, both areas which are talked about a lot in his recent biography. But what would he have been able to do unless he was actually surfing the wave of all this publicly funded technology? Because in fact, everything that makes an iPhone smart, the internet, GPS, touchscreen display, and the Siri voice-activated system, was actually funded by government. And the point here is that that kind of funding, when you look at these different agencies, whether we're talking about DARPA, NIH, the CIA, which through In-Q-Tel, by the way, is one of the biggest providers of public venture capital money in the US. It wasn't just this patchy fixing of different types of market failures. It was often through these departments which were security-led, worrying about national security, doing much more than fixing the public good problem. Often when I talk about this, people say, oh, but you're just talking about the military-industrial complex. And the answer is, well, that's not true. The model within DARPA, which provided most of the funding for the internet, was in fact then copied, if you want, both in Department of Health and most recently in the Department of Energy. This again shows that within health, the National Institutes of Health have been increasing the funding that they've had to supply to both the biotech and the pharmaceutical industry. Just last year, $32 billion is what the US government funded for that particular sector. And Marcia Angels wrote a very provocative book called The Truth Behind the Drug Companies, where she argues that this kind of funding has actually been responsible for the most revolutionary new drugs in the pharmaceutical industry, so those new molecular entities with priority rating, while the pharmaceutical industry itself tends to focus more on the D of the R&D, still very expensive, but much less risky, as well as, I'll be arguing later, things like share buybacks. Now, who today is funding the green revolution? And again, this word revolution is quite important because, coming back to that economist quote before, this idea that somehow all the creativity, the dynamism, the revolutionary spirit is in the private sector, with the government just sort of standing back and creating these conditions. Well, what's fascinating is that this data is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, as well as the Climate Policy Initiative, which used that data, which adds up the entire amount of funding going into green technology today, from private equity, venture capital, corporate funds, and different types of public funds. And what we see here is that the public development banks, these are mainly, by the way, the China Development Bank, the German Development Bank called KfW, BNDES, the Brazilian one, and the European Investment Bank, are actually providing a huge amount of funds, and often they are in fact being used by governments to direct their counter-cyclical spending. So I'll show you later some data from the KfW where after the crisis, they really kicked in spending in this area as part of their Recovery Act. This, by the way, was also true for Obama up until the big, paralysis within the US government. But part of the reason is that precisely as private finance is retreating, some of these public financial institutions have had to step up. And within, again, thinking about this risk space that I was talking about before, the sort of more radical areas where government has to step in, this upper right-hand quadrant is being completely starved of by private finance, and this is, in fact, where most of this public finance is focusing. Now, third point is precisely what I was sort of leading to, which is, on the one hand, you have always had these mission-oriented kind of policies. In fact, lots of the funding that went into the products that then led to the iPhone really date back to the 50s and 60s. But what we have today with this problem that many people are talking about, which is financialization, this is a wonderful example of financialization. This is a table from Andy Haldane's work at the Bank of England. As you have finance really just fueling itself, banks lending to other financial institutions, you have actually had an increased need for public finance to sort of step in, not just for counter-cyclical spending, not just for capital of development of the economy in terms of infrastructure, but also innovation. And one of the problems with this graph in terms of how it's also been interpreted in the UK and in the US is that, then the solution is, right, this, by the way, is this red line here is the gross value added just from financial intermediation. So let's just call it the financial sector, financial institutions. The black line is aggregate real gross value added, which is basically all the value added minus finance and agriculture. And so this is very worrying. It just looks like finance is completely outpacing the real economy. And this is, in fact, one of the reasons why people like Vince Cable in the UK, but also policy leaders in other countries, have been thinking about how to rebalance away from finance towards industry. And one of the real problems with thinking about it that way is this kind of finance versus great old makers, the productive part of the economy, because, in fact, the real economy is extremely financialized. It's just as sick of as the banks. This is just one particular indicator of just how financialized the real economy is, and why is this important to the whole innovation discourse. I'm coming up to that, which is we need proper partners with government to be investing in these big new areas, and if they're just thinking about their stock price, what kind of partners will they be? This black line here, so first of all, in the last 10 years, Fortune 500 companies have spent $3 trillion worth on buybacks. You've probably been reading in the front pages of many newspapers today that lots of companies, including Apple, have been also spending lots on buybacks. Apple, by the way, didn't spend at all on buybacks under Steve Jobs. This was really something that was introduced by Tim Cook when he took over. But the worrying line for anyone who thinks about innovation is really this black line here. I mean, it almost looks like it caused the crisis. This starts peaking around the beginning of the 2000s, up until 2007. And by the way, it started to get flat for a couple years after the crisis, and now it's starting to peak again. This black line is repurchases, so buybacks over R&D. Okay? So in theory, if you had infinite budgets for these companies, they could be spending on everything. They could do R&D, they could do marketing, they could do buybacks. In reality, what's happening is that increasingly financialized companies are actually spending less and less on the R, especially of the R&D. If we look at particular companies, Pfizer and Amgen within the pharmaceutical industry, Cisco within IT is the biggest buybacker. And when you ask these companies, why are you doing this? Why aren't you spending on R&D? Why aren't you behaving like the Xerox Parks and the Bell Labs of the 60s and 70s, which really were co-investing alongside the state in these big new areas? They often say, well, there's no opportunities. This is the right thing to do at this moment when there's no opportunities for investment. And then you look at the two sectors that are doing the most buybacks, and this is oil and pharmaceuticals. And the question is, there's no opportunities in renewables for the energy companies. There's no opportunities in life sciences and health for the pharmaceutical companies. Of course there are. And who's doing them? Often the state. This is a wonderful quote by Bill Gates where he really kind of admits very point blank lots of the things that I've been arguing, even though he really focuses more on the basic research part, which is the typical public good area where you might have a market failure. But he says a key element to get an energy breakthrough is more basic research. And that requires the government to take the lead. Only when that research is pointing towards a product, then we can expect the private sector to kick in. Well, this video is actually from a website of the American Energy Industry Council, which in 2010 was arguing, with Bill Gates being one of the lead arguers, for more government money going into a particular agency, ARPA-E, which I mentioned before, which is really kind of trying to do breakthrough stuff today within renewables, as DARPA did in the internet area. And then you start looking at how much these 7 companies which form the AEIC have themselves been spending on these increasingly financialized practices like buybacks, and it's quite worrying. So the point is not also just to say we want government to do more and more. We really want government to be having a type of engaged partner, as they did with the IT revolution, in which increasingly, in an increasingly financialized economy, it's harder and harder to find that kind of partnership. This just shows the distribution of public and private sector R&D spending in energy, where I provocatively say, where are the energy, Xerox Parks and Bell Labs? And it's not a lack of finance problem. This is one of the big myths, that somehow we don't have enough finance out there, so we need to be forcing banks to lend more to SMEs. We need to get things like the Green Investment Bank going. The problem is we don't have enough patient, long-term committed finance. Okay? And also there is plenty of VC money out there. It's just purposely making a choice not to necessarily spend in this cutting-edge new area. Now, with Caetano Penna, who's in the room, we have a new project where we're organizing a conference in July around it, but also we're writing a couple papers on this, which is, again, asking, really trying to bring Keynes, Minsky, and Schumpeter together, because Keynes and Minsky, of course, talked a lot about financialization and the retreat of private finance from financing the real economy in particular periods of capitalism. And we're actually looking at the form that this mission-oriented financing is taking around the world. And as I mentioned before, we're looking specifically at some development banks, and this is the data for the KfW, which, as you see here, after 2007, precisely when private banks were lending less, the credit crunch, not only did they kick in and do this counter-cyclical lending, but also very much directed it towards this green area, which, as you know, Merkel has very much positioned the German government around that for a country vision to completely denuclearize the economy. But in China, what's fascinating is not only are those figures even greater, it's a bigger country, but the amount of backing that particular companies are actually getting. I mean, this is examples of particular companies, Yingli Green Energy, Suntech also got a lot of money from this particular bank. We're talking billions for individual companies. Now, this isn't very new. I mean, you might have heard also the problems with Solyndra in the US. This was a company also that was backed by the US government from public money. Solyndra got $500 million guaranteed loan. It went bust. People use that to say, oh, another example of government not able to pick winners, choosing a company as opposed to just creating the conditions. Well, the same amount of money was given by the US government to Tesla Motors, which you probably also have heard about today for a different reason, which is really seen as one of the new big success stories of Silicon Valley, with Elon Musk kind of taking Steve Jobs' place as the big hero. Now, this is the point that often, you win some, you lose some with many of these investments precisely because they are so high risk, because innovation really does embody this true Knightian uncertainty. Some of these investments will, in fact, succeed. Some will not. And so, in fact, Suntech recently had some problems. But the point is here that this is no different from what, in fact, has been happening in the history of the US economy, where, as I said, Apple, Compaq, Intel all got financing specifically from government, big amount of money. These figures, however, are absolutely astounding and are part of the reason why, for example, in telecommunications, Huawei, which is #1 in the world, is not being allowed to enter the US market. Why? Because it's seen as anti-competitive, right? Too much backing from government. Well, the real question, I think, is that if Schumpeter's right, and I think we all, at least within the Sprue-type community, think he was, which is that competition in capitalism occurs through innovation. Innovation is not about imperfect competition. This is the way firms compete. If there is less and less private finance available to innovation in terms of that long-term, patient, committed finance, then it's only normal that this finance will be increasingly being provided by the public sector. And what does that mean in terms of how we think about competition rules? Is this anti-competitive, or is this in order to compete? I don't want to give an answer to that because, of course, there's questions of how much money one would allow, and those, that amount of money actually coming from China going to those particular companies is quite astounding in the 2 million marks. But the indicators also that we have to judge those kind of investments, many of these banks are being accused of crowding out, right? They're crowding out private finance. BNDES, for example, is this bank in Brazil, state investment bank in Brazil. In this one day that I was in Brazil last year, there was 30 articles in one day in the Brazilian financial media accusing BNDES of crowding out private finance. The point is here is also, do we even have terminology? What kind of framework, if you want, is informing our metrics to even judge the crowding in, crowding out? Do we have a way to describe what these banks are doing, what also these public agencies are doing in terms of really transforming the technological and industry landscape, in terms of investing in these new frontier areas? In fact, the evidence is that we don't have private finance in that upper right-hand quadrant. What metrics do we have that actually allow us then to judge the performance of not just the banks, but also, by the way, of any public agency? I mean, I often talk about the BBC because the BBC in the UK is also often judged in terms of crowding out potential private broadcasters. And when you look at those articles, and many of these are actually economics articles, we don't feel like we can actually judge the quality of the programs, right? That would be subjective. But this is the point. In order to actually talk about crowding in, crowding out, or what I say often is it's not even crowding in, it's kind of dynamizing in, we need actual qualitative measures which would be able to capture that ability to transform that particular landscape and to be investing in those areas where the private finance is not going. But that requires also to be talking about things like this mission-oriented finance, which is making things happen that would not have happened anyway. And if you look at the kind of critiques, again, of crowding out, those metrics are just simply not there. Picking winners, well, again, many US companies were picked, even in terms of the grant-making process, right? Google's algorithm was funded by the National Science Foundation to which ended up fueling the technology in that particular company. The SBIR money is going to particular companies. These companies are indeed picked. And the problem is that we also have to admit just how risky that investment process is. So you're not just spending, you're not just creating the conditions, you really are taking on risk with this wide variety of different financing tools, which, however, if we just think of them as government spending as opposed to government investing in these high-risk areas, not only do you have a trouble then with the metrics, as I was talking about before, but also with this fundamental relationship, which is, well, what's the relationship then between risk, because we have to define it that way, government as a lead risk taker, and the rewards, because of course, anytime you take a finance class, the first thing you're taught is about this relationship between risk and rewards. So the fourth pillar, which I'll go through quickly, is, and let me just skip through some of this, but this is the problem today, right? And all sorts of inequality. This is not a problem in terms of profits. Profits, in fact, are at record high levels in terms of percentage of GDP. And the problem of wages completely not keeping up, and the difference between profits and wages, again, as percentage of GDP being as skewed as ever. The way that people have talked about this is really mainly in terms of skills, right? That when you have these big technological revolutions, like the IT revolution, and the worry is, in terms of the future, that some people just get left behind. There's a skill bias, right? Some people will not have the skills and will fare much worse than they did previous to the introduction of those technologies. And what I want to argue is that by not having the right framework through which to talk about what the public sector has actually been doing in these different areas in providing this kind of innovation-led growth, which, if you think of all those general purpose technologies that I put up there before, create then decades of growth, we then don't have a way to actually talk about the collective, if you want, risk-taking, the collective value creation process that there is. And we have had a process of value extraction, which I think has been much more responsible for the extreme levels of inequality, more than just skills, which I think explains much more the middle levels of inequality, which I don't want to get into now. Now, why this is important, I think, for the innovation community is that often when we talk about inequality, we don't necessarily then apply what we know about innovation. Okay? So basically what I've been arguing up until now is innovation is extremely uncertain. It's also very collective, with the public sector actually taking a massive role, which we haven't had the words to talk about. But we also know from all sorts of work, like people like Paul David, who talks about path dependency, that innovation is very cumulative. Innovation today builds on innovation yesterday. So if you think about also this area underneath this curve, the integral, as the potential returns that come about in this cumulative innovation process, it can be that if certain agents are able to come in the middle, right, after the state has done lots of the hard work, and if we don't have the framework to even talk about this collective group of different risk takers and allow certain actors to be hyped up, okay, like I believe the role of, say, venture capital funding has been completely hyped up, and if policymakers are just there, as Warren Buffett argues, allowing them to get a very easy ride. Don't forget, or maybe I didn't tell you, but that Warren Buffett quote is also spectacular because he talks about a specific date. He says capital gains tax was 40% in 1976 in the US. And when it came down, and it came down by 50% to 1981, just 5 years later, that did not increase investment. Who lobbied for that? It was actually the National Venture Capital Association, which formed in 1976, and it almost formed on purpose to start, being able to have a voice within government. And this was the policy they really fought for, reducing capital gains tax, and they were very successful. They said, if you want a knowledge economy, the new economy, innovation, you have to, reduce our capital gains. And successful in doing that. And those kind of policies, and I would include there things like the patent box today, which was lobbied for by one company, I won't mention the name, in the UK government, really then does allow lots of this, if you want, capture to happen, as well as these financialized practices like share buybacks. And that's a very different analysis, if you want, which I've written 2 or 3 papers about this with Bill Lazanik. One is called the risk-reward nexus, of talking about what went wrong in periods like the 1990s. Talking about value extraction, you need a theory of value creation. It's not just about talking about speculators and rent seekers. It requires also a theory of talking about what is it that the different actors in the system have actually contributed to. And one of my main points is we have not had the language and the theory to talk about the role that the public sector actually played in that process. And what is the public sector? That's taxpayer money, right? So when in places like Silicon Valley, you have things like the public school system completely suffering, since the 1970s. Well, that is a huge problem given that that particular part of the world benefited so much from these kind of investments, which we haven't had really the language to talk about. Now, recently I've been thinking about, well, what should we do? In theory, we're told that taxes are enough, that growth will ensue from these kind of investments that will show up in terms of taxes both that the companies pay, but also that the jobs that are created will pay. Well, we know that's no longer true, both because lots of these companies themselves, whether it's Google, Amazon, Apple, pay very little back in terms of percentage of how much they're actually earning back to government, but also because, of course, the jobs will inevitably, naturally go abroad because of globalization. So if you then do have a framework that can talk about the state as a lead investor, a lead risk taker, and because we know that there will be lots of failures, there will be 10 cylinders for every Tesla, then what to do, and actually talking about some sort of direct reward mechanism, I think should be at least talked about. The conversation should be there. And without necessarily focusing on the exact mechanisms, the point is that you only even enter this conversation if you first admit that the government has been, in fact, a lead risk taker and not just creating the conditions, the infrastructure, the education, but actually investing directly in incredibly risky technologies. Again, for every internet, you have 9 Concords. So whether it's retaining some sort of equity, as, by the way, is done in Scandinavia, whether it's using income contingent loans, we do that for students, why not for companies, or retaining a golden share of the IPR, this is the kind of thing I think is increasingly important to talk about, especially as government budgets are so under attack. If we want this kind of innovation-led growth, if it's true that government has been a lead player, well, where will the money come from? Either you just print the money and do directed quantitative easing, very little support for that right now politically, increase taxes to what they were under Eisenhower, 90% upper marginal rate, under Republican general. Also, I think very little political support for that, or let's talk about other mechanisms, and you'd be surprised to hear how some are extremely close to that conversation, and some in very surprising places are instead quite open to it. But you'd have to have a framework that would actually lead you even to begin asking that question. And of course, that would allow you to have not just smart growth, not just green growth, where some of the profits for the internet were plugged back into things like green technology. Again, the specific mechanism's quite difficult, but it can be done. But also this more inclusive growth where the taxpayers, again, the example I gave you of in Silicon Valley public schools going completely downhill since the 1970s, we could perhaps get some of this money reinvested back into areas where the taxpayers who are funding it actually see the rewards more directly. Lastly, I don't think that we should be arguing just for more and more government. This is not what I'm arguing for. I'm arguing let's admit what government has done. Let's make sure that there is a risk-reward relationship, but let's also make sure that when government does enter, which it should, it always has, and it should, if we want the green revolution, government will have to play a very active role, but it should play a transformative role. I've been quite inspired by the work of John Abrams, who used to be at Sussex, unfortunately left, who talks about these biases within the life sciences industry, where all the research is on drugs. So not only is there the problem that I mentioned before, that then lots of the revolutionary new drugs are coming out of this public funding, which we don't admit is actually driving lots of the revolutionary outputs. We just pretend it's just there funding the background. But also, it's all about drugs. So the public sector, when it enters, shouldn't work within that bias, which he calls I can't even pronounce it, pharmaceuticalization. It should expand and go into the areas that are completely starved today, like lifestyle. And it's a bunch of hippies like me that take vitamins and go running for, who knows why. There's no research on that, or proper research, right? So transform that landscape, work within diagnostic, surgical treatments, and lifestyle. Carlota Perez's work also talks about the really transformative role of government when she says, look back at the mass production revolution, that would not have been fully deployed through, over time without a very active government role, even in that deployment phase, thinking up things like suburbanization, which is not that people just woke up one day and wanted to, go live in the suburbs. That was part of government policy to actually redirect that particular revolution a particular way. So she talks about green not as a revolution, but a potential redirection of the IT revolution in a green direction because we haven't fully deployed the IT revolution at all. If you look at the figures that some people have, Robert Gordon and Paul David have looked at this, comparing electrification and the IT revolution, we are still at a very early point in deployment, and government could potentially have a role in actually making a choice in which direction the IT revolution should go. This is, of course, also similar and complementary to Andy Sterling's work, who talks about multiple pathways. Why is it that research within biotech, which is hugely publicly funded, is going in one way and not another? Or within IT, there's different pathways. By admitting the role that government plays, we can also have more of a democratic debate to think about those pathways. Shale gas, by the way, as many of you probably know, was almost all government funded. That's not necessarily good. I often get accused as being some romanticist about the state. This is not the point. The point is the state is extremely powerful, so we better be careful and actually have more of a democratic debate about which direction we want things to go. Because it is transformative, it is revolutionary, which doesn't, however, mean that it's necessarily good. And Johann Schott's work, of course, and we're so happy that he's now at SPRU, is very important. His work and the work of Frank Giels and really talking about transitions actually requires a theory of the state. He was just saying this to me the other day. He says, you talk about the state, but what's your theory of the state? Well, of course, that's absolutely fundamental to all of this. And when I do talk about the state, I talk about, similar to Fred Block and his co-authors, talk about a decentralized network state, but this does include, agencies like within the UK, as I said, the BBC, that I really think that unless you are also investing within these agencies, you don't even have the intelligence to think about these big missions and challenges. The example I often give is the government digital services in the UK. They made a radical decision to have their own website. So when you want to get a white paper, you actually have to go to Google instead of a government website. They first outsourced it to a company called Serco, which charged them $25 million and produced a very bad website. They all of a sudden said, hey, why are we doing this? Why don't we invest ourselves in this capacity? They brought in people from the iPlayer, from the BBC iPlayer, and created this new website called u.gov, which has just won this big international prize. But in the meantime, not only made something that's much less costly, not only brought in, very smart people to work within government, but in doing that also makes it kind of fun to go work within the public sector. Because we often talk about this problem of STEM subjects. We want more kids to learn about science, but of course one of the big challenges is we want some of the smartest brains out there, whether we're talking about economists or scientists, to actually go into these public sector institutions, which will in fact then be responsible together in a decentralized way to think about these big missions, and that's very hard if we outsource all the fun stuff. Just lastly, what I think is needed is to change the words, the discourse, not just the theory, the economic theory, but the way we talk about these things. I was very inspired by the work of Tony Judt, who in his last book before he died, he talked about it as a discursive battle that we have with the state. He said all of a sudden in the 1970s, the word administration popped up. How boring is that, talking about the government is just administering? Would you want to go work for an institution that just administers versus has visions and moves and shakes things and makes big things happen? And so what I've been trying to argue is we really need to change the way we talk about these investments, and also, of course, go from a market failure view of the justification for public intervention to this mission-oriented view, which once you trickle it down, it really changes how we talk about everything. You're not de-risking the private sector, you are sharing the risks, and hence also the rewards. Lots of this was based on work that I've done recently, very recently, just in 2003, as well as some work that I'm doing with both Carlotta and Caetano Penna, some work in progress. I've talked way too much, so I hope we can still get questions.